The year was 1914. Europe basked in what many called the Beautiful Era, a time of unprecedented prosperity, technological marvels, and cultural flourishing. Electric lights illuminated grand boulevards, automobiles puttered through cobblestone streets, and the upper classes waltzed in opulent ballrooms, believing they lived in the pinnacle of human civilization. Yet beneath this glittering surface, a web of hatred, suspicion, and military preparation stretched across the continent like invisible tripwires, waiting for a single spark to ignite the most devastating war the world had ever known. On a sunny morning in Sarajevo, that spark would come from the most unlikely of sources: a wrong turn by a royal driver and a 19-year-old assassin with a sandwich. Within 6 weeks, this moment of chaos would transform into a global catastrophe that would consume empires, redraw the map of the world, and claim the lives of over 15 million people. But the Great War didn't begin with that fateful gunshot. It began decades earlier, in the minds of generals, the calculations of diplomats, and the hearts of nations convinced that war was not only inevitable, but necessary. The question that has haunted historians for over a century remains as complex today as it was in 1914. What truly triggered World War I? Was it the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand? The rigid alliance system that turned a regional conflict into a global war? The arms race that had militarized an entire continent? Or was it something deeper, a fundamental shift in how nations viewed power, honor, and their place in the world? To understand how Europe stumbled into the abyss, we must explore the complex web of alliances, tensions, and events that transformed the continent into a powder keg waiting to explode. This isn't simply a story of politicians and generals making calculated decisions in smoke-filled rooms. It's the story of how an entire civilization, drunk on its own success and technological prowess, convinced itself that a short, decisive war would solve all its problems and secure lasting peace. The roots of the Great War stretch back to the very foundations of modern Europe, to the unification of Germany in 1871, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the scramble for colonies in Africa and Asia, and the emergence of new ideologies that place the nation above the individual. These forces, combined with revolutionary changes in military technology and a diplomatic system based on secret treaties and mutual distrust, created a situation where a single act of violence in a distant corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire could trigger a continental war. By the dawn of the 20th century, Europe had divided itself into two hostile camps, each convinced that the other posed an existential threat to their way of life. The delicate balance of power that had maintained relative peace since the end of the Napoleonic Wars was crumbling under the weight of new ambitions, old grudges, and fundamental changes in how nations projected power. The first crack in this system appeared with the emergence of a unified German empire in 1871. Under the brilliant but manipulative leadership of Otto von Bismarck, Germany had transformed from a collection of fractured states into the most powerful nation in continental Europe. This rapid rise terrified Germany's neighbors, particularly France, which had been humiliated in the Franco-Prussian War and forced to pay massive reparations while watching German troops march through the Arc de Triomphe. Bismarck understood that Germany's sudden dominance had made it the target of potential coalitions. His solution was a masterpiece of diplomatic engineering, a complex system of treaties and alliances designed to isolate France and prevent the formation of a two-front war. The dual alliance with Austria-Hungary in 1879, expanded to include Italy in the Triple Alliance of 1882, gave Germany powerful partners in any potential conflict. Meanwhile, the secret reinsurance treaty with Russia ensured that the Tsar would not align with France against German interests. But Bismarck's system depended on his personal skill and the restraint of his successors. When Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed the Iron Chancellor in 1890, he also abandoned the careful balance that had kept Europe stable. The young Kaiser, driven by dreams of German greatness and a personal rivalry with his cousin, British King Edward VII, began pursuing a more aggressive foreign policy that would ultimately unite Germany's enemies against her. The collapse of the Bismarckian system triggered a diplomatic revolution that reshaped European politics. In 1894, France and Russia signed a military alliance that created exactly the two-front threat that Bismarck had worked so hard to prevent. The Franco-Russian alliance was born not out of ideological compatibility. Republican France and autocratic Russia shared little beyond their fear of Germany, but out of strategic necessity. The situation became even more dangerous when Britain, traditionally committed to splendid isolation from continental affairs, began to reconsider its position. The rapid expansion of the German Navy under Admiral von Tirpitz convinced British leaders that Germany posed a direct threat to British naval supremacy and, by extension, to the British Empire itself. The Anglo-French Entente of 1904, followed by the Anglo-Russian Entente of 1907, created the Triple Entente that would face the Triple Alliance in the coming war. But these alliance systems were more than just diplomatic arrangements. They were expressions of deeper tensions that had been building across Europe for decades. Nationalism, the idea that each ethnic group deserved its own state, was tearing apart the multi-ethnic empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire while fueling ambitions in Germany, France, and Russia. The Industrial Revolution had given nations unprecedented military capabilities, leading to an arms race that consumed increasing portions of national budgets and created military establishments with their own interests in conflict. Perhaps most dangerous of all was the culture of militarism that had infected European society. Military service became a rite of passage for young men. Generals were celebrated as national heroes, and the idea of a cleansing war that would test national character became increasingly popular among intellectuals and politicians. The Franco-Prussian War had been quick and decisive. Many Europeans convinced themselves that modern wars would follow the same pattern. A few months of glorious combat, followed by a victorious peace that would settle all outstanding disputes. This toxic combination of alliance obligations, nationalist fervor, and military romanticism created a situation where rational decision-making became nearly impossible. Each nation's leaders found themselves trapped by commitments they had made in peacetime, forced to choose between national honor and national survival. With no clear understanding of the catastrophic consequences their choices would unleash. The spark that would ignite this continental powder keg came from the most volatile region in Europe, the Balkans, often called the powder keg of Europe, for good reason. Here, the declining Ottoman Empire had left a power vacuum filled by competing nationalisms, great power rivalries, and a complex web of ethnic and religious tensions that defied easy resolution. At the center of this chaos stood Austria-Hungary, a multinational empire struggling to maintain control over dozens of ethnic groups, each with their own languages, traditions, and increasingly, their own national ambitions. The dual monarchy had annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, adding another volatile element to an already unstable mix. The province's Serb population looked to the independent Kingdom of Serbia as their protector and potential liberator, while Serbia itself harbored dreams of creating a greater Serbia that would unite all South Slavs under Serbian leadership. Into this tinderbox stepped Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and a man whose liberal views and plans for federal reform had made him enemies among both German-Austrian conservatives and Slavic nationalists. His decision to visit Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, a date sacred to Serbian nationalism, was seen by many as a deliberate provocation. The conspiracy to assassinate Franz Ferdinand was organized by the Black Hand, a Serbian secret society led by Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijević, known by his code name Apis. The Black Hand had extensive connections within Serbian military intelligence and had been responsible for numerous terrorist attacks throughout the Balkans. For the Sarajevo mission, they recruited 6 young Bosnian Serb students, providing them with weapons, training, and a network of accomplices to ensure their escape. The morning of June 28th began like a carefully choreographed disaster. The first assassination attempt failed when Nedeljko Čabrinović threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, but the explosive bounced off and detonated under the following vehicle, wounding several officers and bystanders. Franz Ferdinand, displaying remarkable composure, insisted on continuing with the planned program, even stopping to visit the wounded in the hospital. It was this act of compassion that sealed his fate. The Archduke's driver, unfamiliar with the changed route and confused by conflicting instructions, made a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street. Directly past a cafe where 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip was eating a sandwich, having given up on the assassination after the morning's failure. Finding himself face-to-face with his target at a distance of just 5 feet, Princip drew his pistol and fired 2 shots. The first struck Sophie, the Archduke's wife, in the stomach. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The dying Archduke's last words, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children," would echo through history as the final peaceful moment before Europe plunged into 4 years of unprecedented carnage. But even as Franz Ferdinand breathed his last in the arms of his beloved wife, few observers understood that they had just witnessed the end of the old world order. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed the dangerous dynamics that had been building across Europe for decades. In Vienna, the news was initially met with indifference. Franz Ferdinand had been unpopular among the Austrian elite, and many saw his death as removing an obstacle to a more aggressive policy toward Serbia. However, as details of the plot emerged and Serbian involvement became apparent, calls for revenge began to mount. The key figure in transforming a terrorist attack into a world war was Count Leopold Berchtold, Austria-Hungary's foreign minister, who saw the assassination as the perfect opportunity to settle accounts with Serbia once and for all. But Berchtold faced a crucial problem. Austria-Hungary was not strong enough to confront Serbia alone, especially if Russia came to Serbia's aid. The solution lay in securing German support through the alliance system that Bismarck had created decades earlier. On July 5, 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II issued what would become known as the blank check, a promise of unconditional German support for whatever action Austria-Hungary chose to take against Serbia. This decision, made during a leisurely meeting at Potsdam Palace, was perhaps the single most important moment in the chain of events leading to war. The Kaiser and his advisors convinced themselves that the conflict could be localized, that Russia would not risk war over Serbia, and that even if a broader conflict emerged, Germany's superior military would ensure a quick victory. The July crisis that followed demonstrated how the alliance system had created a diplomatic doomsday machine that transformed a regional dispute into a global catastrophe. Austria-Hungary spent 3 weeks crafting an ultimatum to Serbia that was deliberately designed to be unacceptable. The document delivered on July 23rd demanded that Serbia suppress all anti-Austrian publications, dissolve nationalist organizations, and allow Austrian officials to participate directly in the investigation of the assassination plot on Serbian soil, a violation of sovereignty that no independent nation could accept. Serbia's response, delivered on July 25th, was a masterpiece of diplomatic skill. The Serbian government accepted most of Austria's demands while rejecting only those that would compromise their sovereignty. appealing to international law and offering to submit the dispute to international arbitration. But Austria-Hungary had already decided on war. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and began bombardment of Belgrade. The moment Austria-Hungary's artillery began pounding Belgrade, the alliance system that had been designed to preserve peace transformed into a mechanism for spreading war across the entire continent. Each nation's leaders found themselves prisoners of their own previous commitments, forced to choose between abandoning their allies and honoring obligations that would drag them into a conflict none of them fully understood or wanted. Russia faced the most agonizing decision. Tsar Nicholas II, a weak and indecisive ruler, was torn between his desire to avoid war and his government's commitment to protect Slavic interests in the Balkans. Russian public opinion, inflamed by pan-Slavic propaganda and outrage over Austrian aggression, demanded action. More importantly, Russian military leaders argued that failure to support Serbia would destroy Russian credibility in the Balkans and leave the empire vulnerable to future Austrian and German expansion. The Russian mobilization process revealed the fatal flaw in European military planning that would make war inevitable once the crisis reached a certain point. Russian generals had spent years perfecting a mobilization plan that was designed to be foolproof, but was also impossibly rigid. The plan called for the simultaneous mobilization of forces against both Austria, Hungary, and Germany, based on the assumption that any conflict with Austria would inevitably involve Germany as well. When Tsar Nicholas II ordered partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary on July 29th, his generals informed him that such a limited mobilization was impossible. The Russian army could mobilize against all its potential enemies or none at all. Faced with this technical constraint and growing pressure from his advisors, the Tsar authorized general mobilization on July 30th, 1914. This decision, made in a moment of confusion and panic, made World War virtually certain. Germany's response demonstrated how the alliance system had created a situation where rational calculation became secondary to military timetables and strategic paranoia. German military planning was dominated by the Schlieffen Plan, a complex strategy designed to solve the fundamental problem of fighting a two-front war against France and Russia. The plan called for a rapid knockout blow against France through Belgium, followed by a transfer of forces to the Eastern Front to deal with the slower mobilizing Russian army. The Schlieffen Plan's rigid timetable meant that any delay in implementation would doom Germany to fighting the exact two-front war that German strategy was designed to avoid. When news of Russian mobilization reached Berlin, German military leaders argued that they had no choice but to implement their own mobilization plan immediately. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia and demanded that France declare its neutrality in the coming conflict. The French response revealed how completely the alliance system had polarized European politics. France had spent over 40 years preparing for a war of revenge against Germany, building fortifications along their shared border, and cultivating the Russian alliance as a counterweight to German power. French President Raymond Poincaré and his government saw German aggression against Russia as the moment they had long anticipated, the chance to recover Alsace-Lorraine and restore French prestige in Europe. France's mobilization order, issued on August 1st, was met with an outpouring of patriotic enthusiasm that surprised even French leaders. The socialist and anarchist movements that had been expected to oppose the war instead rallied to the national cause, creating a sacred union that temporarily suspended all political divisions in the face of external threat. French generals, confident in their Plan 618 strategy of offensive operations in Alsace-Lorraine, believed they could defeat Germany in a matter of weeks. The final and most crucial decision came from Britain, whose entry into the war would transform a continental conflict into a genuine world war. British leaders had spent years debating their obligations under the ententes with France and Russia, which were far less binding than the formal alliance commitments that bound other European powers. The British public was deeply divided about continental involvement, and Prime Minister Herbert Asquith's Liberal government included many members who opposed military intervention. The German decision to implement the Schlieffen Plan by invading Belgium provided British leaders with the justification they needed to enter the war. The 1839 Treaty of London had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, and German violation of this treaty allowed Britain to present military intervention as a matter of international law and national honor, rather than alliance politics. More practically, German control of the Belgian coast would pose an unacceptable threat to British naval supremacy and homeland security. On August 4, 1914, as German troops poured across the Belgian border, Britain delivered an ultimatum demanding German withdrawal. When the deadline passed without a German response, Britain declared war on Germany, completing the alignment that would define the next 4 years of global conflict. The mobilization of the European powers in the first week of August 1914 demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of modern military organization. Across the continent, millions of men reported to mobilization centers with an enthusiasm that shocked contemporary observers. In Berlin, Paris, London, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, crowds gathered in the streets to cheer departing soldiers, singing patriotic songs and waving national flags. The popular mood was one of excitement rather than dread. Most people believed the war would be over by Christmas, with their side achieving a glorious victory that would settle all outstanding international disputes. This mass enthusiasm reflected the successful penetration of nationalist ideology into European popular culture. For decades, newspapers, schools, and political movements had taught ordinary citizens that their nation's interests were more important than individual concerns, that military service was the highest form of patriotic duty, and that war was a natural and even beneficial aspect of international relations. The generation that marched off to war in 1914 had been raised on stories of military glory and national heroism that bore little resemblance to the industrial slaughter they were about to experience. The pivotal moment when World War I became inevitable occurred not on the battlefields of Belgium or the Eastern Front, but in the conference rooms and telegraph offices where European leaders made their final desperate attempts to prevent the catastrophe they could see approaching. The last real chance for peace came during the final days of July 1914, when a series of diplomatic initiatives might have contained the Austro-Serbian conflict and prevented its escalation into a continental war. The most promising of these peace initiatives came from an unexpected source: Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. On July 28th, after reading Serbia's conciliatory response to the Austrian ultimatum, the Kaiser experienced what he called a moment of clarity. In a margin note on the diplomatic dispatch, he wrote, "A brilliant solution, and in barely 48 hours. This is more than could have been expected. A great moral victory for Vienna, but with it, every pretext for war falls to the ground." The Kaiser immediately sent what became known as the Willy-Nicky telegrams to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, proposing direct negotiations to resolve the crisis. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that personal diplomacy between the two emperors might succeed where formal diplomatic channels had failed. The Tsar responded positively, suggesting that the matter be submitted to the Hague Conference for international arbitration. But by this point, the crisis had developed its own momentum that even emperors could not control. In Vienna, Count Berchtold had convinced Emperor Franz Joseph that anything less than military action would represent a humiliating retreat that would destroy Austria-Hungary's credibility as a great power. In St. Petersburg, Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov argued that Russian backing down would encourage further Austrian aggression, and potentially lead to the complete elimination of Russian influence in the Balkans. The final tragedy of the July crisis was that none of the key decision-makers fully understood the consequences of their choices. They were operating with outdated assumptions about the nature of modern warfare, believing that any conflict would resemble the brief, decisive wars of the late 19th century, rather than the prolonged industrial slaughter that actually awaited them. European military leaders had spent years studying the American Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War, but they had focused on tactical lessons while ignoring the broader implications of industrial warfare for society and politics. The moment when diplomatic solutions became impossible occurred during the night of July 29–30, when Tsar Nicholas II changed his mind about mobilization for the second time in 12 hours. After initially ordering partial mobilization, then canceling it in response to Kaiser Wilhelm's telegram, the Tsar finally authorized general mobilization after his military advisors convinced him that partial mobilization was technically impossible and that delay would give Germany an insurmountable advantage. This decision triggered what historians call the war by timetable, a cascade of mobilizations driven not by political calculation but by military necessity. Once Russia began mobilizing, Germany felt compelled to mobilize in response. Once Germany mobilized, France had to mobilize to avoid being caught unprepared. Once the mobilization process began, it created its own logic that overwhelmed diplomatic efforts to maintain peace. The final diplomatic collapse came on August 3rd, when British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey's proposal for a four-power conference to mediate the crisis was rejected by Germany. German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, operating under the assumption that British neutrality could still be maintained, made the fatal error of dismissing British concerns as irrelevant to what he saw as a purely continental conflict. At 11:02 p.m. on August 4, 1914, the British ultimatum to Germany expired without a response. In London, Foreign Secretary Grey stood at his office window watching the streetlights being lit and made his famous observation, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." It was a moment of profound historical awareness, the recognition that an entire era of European civilization was ending, though few could imagine the scale of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. The outbreak of World War I represents one of history's greatest examples of how a complex system can produce catastrophic results that none of its participants intended or desired. No European leader in July 1914 wanted a continental war, yet the combination of alliance obligations, military planning, nationalist pressure, and diplomatic rigidity made such a war virtually inevitable once the crisis reached a critical point. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand provided the spark, but the fuel for the conflagration had been accumulating for decades. The rapid rise of Germany had destabilized the European balance of power, creating fears and resentments that were channeled into competing alliance systems. The growth of nationalism had undermined the multinational empires that had provided stability since the Congress of Vienna, while the arms race had militarized European society and created military establishments with their own interests in conflict. Perhaps most importantly, European leaders had convinced themselves that war was not only inevitable, but beneficial, a test of national character that would strengthen the victor and eliminate outdated political arrangements. This romantic view of warfare, inherited from an era of limited conflicts between professional armies, proved catastrophically wrong when applied to the industrial age's capacity for mass destruction. The alliance system that was designed to preserve peace through deterrence instead created a mechanism for transforming local conflicts into global wars. The rigid military planning that was intended to provide security through preparedness instead created timetables that eliminated diplomatic flexibility when it was most needed. The nationalist ideologies that were meant to create stronger, more unified states, instead, produced ethnic conflicts that tore apart the existing international order. The July crisis revealed the fundamental weakness of the European state system as it had evolved by 1914. Decision-makers operating under intense pressure, with limited information and conflicting advice, were forced to make irreversible choices whose consequences they could not foresee. The result was a war that consumed 4 empires, killed over 15 million people, and created political conditions that would lead to an even more destructive conflict just 20 years later. Understanding how Europe stumbled into World War I offers crucial lessons for our own time. It demonstrates how complex systems can produce unintended consequences, how alliance commitments can limit diplomatic options, and how the militarization of international relations can create pressures for conflict, even when all parties prefer peace. Most importantly, it shows how quickly a stable international order can collapse when the assumptions underlying that order are no longer valid. The Great War began not because anyone wanted it, but because the structures and ideas that governed European politics made it increasingly difficult to avoid. The assassination in Sarajevo was merely the final link in a chain of causation that stretched back decades, connecting German unification to Balkan nationalism, military technology to diplomatic strategy, and personal honor to national survival. The story of how World War I began continues to resonate because it reveals timeless truths about human nature, political systems, and the unintended consequences of our best intentions. As we face our own era of international tension and rapid change, understanding how the old world order collapsed can help us build more stable and peaceful arrangements for the future. If you found this exploration of the Great War's origins compelling, dive deeper into this pivotal moment in history. Subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries that reveal the hidden connections between past and present. Like this video if it changed your understanding of how complex events unfold, and share it with others who appreciate the intricate web of causes that shape our world. What aspect of World War I's outbreak surprised you most? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on whether such a catastrophic miscalculation could happen again in our interconnected world. Your insights contribute to our ongoing conversation about how we can learn from history's greatest tragedies to build a more peaceful future.